Great. Okay. Welcome, everyone. I'm so glad that you are able to join us with this web series. On behalf of Professor Lynn Denning and myself, I'm very excited about us getting the Carnegie African Diaspora Fellowship. And the primary aim of the fellowship is for us to be able to increase or enhance clinical trials in Africa. So this is something that is dear to both of us, and I'm sure that is dear to quite a number of people and all of you that are watching as well. So as part of the project that we have, one of the things that the Carnegie African Diaspora Fellowship really wants us to also get into is the idea of having training seminars or forum that would enhance education in the area of the topics that we have. So I'm very excited that we were able to pull out outstanding speakers across the globe, not only in Africa, who have immense experience conducting oncology clinical trials in Africa or in partnership with Africans. So you are really in for a treat. I think you are going to get a lot out of this. I'm going to start with just a very brief introduction with respect to laying the background for clinical trials or oncology clinical trials in Africa before we have the presentation of Dr. Dean Colom. Okay, I tested this and it worked. There we go. So the first thing I wanted to lay the background on is just for everyone to be able to have an understanding of the need for the engagement, recruitment, retention of Black populations for clinical trials overall, not only in the area of oncology, especially in Africa. So I'm going to focus this presentation on Africa, but I want to lay the groundwork so that you are very aware of what is going on. So as you may or may not know, the Black population is about 17% of the world population, is over 1 billion. Blacks all over the world are disproportionately affected by cancer globally. I happen to focus my research area in the area of prostate cancer, and Black men actually have the greatest burden of prostate cancer, greatest mortality, and greatest morbidity. What is sad about the whole issue is when you look at the Black race in general, that there's huge underrepresentation of Blacks in clinical trials. And because of the underrepresentation of Blacks in clinical trials, this continues to magnify the health disparities that they experience, and that is because there's not enough study on that represent them, and that we are able to really understand the therapy intervention or any kind of intervention in the Black population and in Africa in general. So when you look at this, one of the things that I did was go on the map of all studies on clinicaltrials.gov, and this is one of the other limitations that we actually have. If everybody could please mute their mic if they're not speaking, because I'm getting an echo, so that it will be clear to everyone. This is one of the limitations that we actually have. In Africa in general, it is very difficult to get access to where clinical trials are taking place. And it is very difficult for patients to know where clinical trials are taking place. This is one of the reasons that we're actually doing the project that we are doing. But one of the best sites for you to sort of take a look at where clinical trials are, is taking place is the National Cancer Institute, clinicaltrials.gov. And so when you look at the map, you can see very clearly that Africa is really underrepresented with clinical trials. The whole of Africa, as big as it is only 7,000, a little bit over 7,000 of clinical trials that is recorded. And when you start looking at Africa in general, you can see that it is really concentrated in only very few places. So when you look at sub-Saharan Africa, absolutely there's limited clinical trials that is being recorded in this particular area. And it may be an issue of underrepresentation, which I think is just a little bit that contributes to that. The most significant aspect is because there is lack of infrastructure, there's lack of resources, there's lack of expertise to be able to do clinical trials in Africa. So this map is really kind of tells us a little bit of what the challenges are. So this is something that I know that a lot of the presenters that we are going to have over the series of several weeks that we're going to have are going to touch on. And that is the fact that clinical trials is very, very important. We are all aware of that. It is very important to be able to have access to new approaches, to be able to understand what works, in which population does it work. It is really the gold standards to develop intervention. That's it. Clinical trials is the gold standard. And it is not that they're not risk associated with clinical trials. There are some risks that are slightly associated with clinical trials, but overall, when you look at the benefits and the risks, the benefits definitely outweigh the risks. So clinical trials is really, really very important to be able to move the science or the treatment forward in any other areas of chronic heart disease. Another thing that I want to briefly touch upon, which I think has a significant impact on looking at clinical trials in Africa or in underrepresented populations all over the world, is the fact that while we are still struggling with being able to have clinical trials and being able to be represented in clinical trials, every day we are getting health and biomedical innovations. And this is good. It's not that the health and biomedical innovations are not good. The problem is it continues to magnify the underrepresentation of certain populations and is contributing to the problem. And so we really need to take a look and figure out how do we address the problem. And I'm going to give you examples of how health and biomedical innovations are contributing to the problems that Africa has, or low resource countries has, or underrepresented minorities such as Blacks in the United States have. You think about the GWAS, the Genome-Wide Association studies. It has really revolutionized the field of human quantitative genetics. It's really necessary. It is very important that GWAS it uncovers evidences to prevent, diagnose, and treat diseases, right? This is great, but you think about it. There is limited representations of Africans in GWAS. Even in the United States, there's only about 3% Blacks that are represented in the GWAS, right? Very limited. What does that mean? If Africans are not represented in the GWAS, it definitely means that we are not being taken into consideration in developing appropriate prevention, diagnosis, and treatment for cancer. So that's kind of really huge. I love the innovation. I love the fact that we are going on into this. The problem is we continue to be underrepresented, which means it is drawing us back as a continent. Also, another innovation is precision or personalized medicine. It carries the promise of tailoring treatment, prevention, and behavioral interventions to each individual person's in very precise and personalized manner. Again, what is the problem? Africans are underrepresented. That's the problem. Blacks are underrepresented. That's the problem. So how can you get precision or personalized medicine when you can't even get the general care or the general medicine, or when you are not even represented right now in clinical trials? So that's kind of another huge problem that we have. Another problem is the area of pharmacogenomics. My background is in pharmacy, so I am very excited when we start talking about pharmacogenomics, which is when you actually use the person's genes in such a way that you are able to target the drug to that particular individual. It simply means that you are going to have the best drug or the best dose. Take a guess. Another problem, we don't have enough representation of Africans, or in the United States, because I do recognize that there are people in the United States who are, logging, or people, or our brothers and sisters in the Caribbean also who have logged into this webinar. We are still not represented. So to summarize, the world of health innovation and health technology keeps moving forward, but we are not represented. Africans are not represented. Blacks in general all over the world are not represented. Our Caribbean brothers and sisters, they are not. Our population is not represented. It's time that we really, really need to address this, because if we continue to be underrepresented, I can assure you that all the innovative therapies and treatments and interventions would not effectively address that problem. And that's why this is really good. When you look at clinical trials in Africa, especially the sub-Saharan Africa, we have what I term the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good is we have large pool of patients and participants for recruitment. It can easily be done. My consortium, the Prostate Cancer Transatlantic Consortium, we just started a study last year that we are looking at prostate cancer in a cohort of Nigerian men, Cameroonian men in Nigeria, Cameroon, and in the United States. Within 6 months, we were able to recruit over 700 participants. So there's a large pool of participants. There is faster patient recruitment. Patient can be recruited in such a short timeline. The operational cost is not that high. You know, there's a way for us to work very closely with the regulatory bodies so that we do not have any barriers. And there are unique opportunities for brand exposure to therapy. It's very, very unique, because you really do get a lot of diversity in the populations that we have. But what is the bad? The challenges that is faced in Africa is lengthy approval process to start a clinical trial, very long. There are recruitment issues, especially for participants in rural areas. We have to think about patient adherence issues. There are challenges with follow-up. There are challenges with ethical review and approval. This is one area that we really, really need to work on. And there's always political instability, which really affects the whole process and the whole area of being able to have effective infrastructure to support clinical trials. And the political instability does not have to do with just the country, but also has to do with the academic settings as well. And I know that my colleagues who are in Africa can speak to this better than I can. But my short time in visiting institution, I could really see this myself, that is really getting in the way. And what is the bad? Additional bad is the standard of care issues. The standard of care is so scary that sometimes it really, really makes it impossible to be able to implement any clinical trials. There's limited access to healthcare. There's limited access to skilled clinical trials workforce. There's limited availability of treatment therapies. We are currently in dialogue to bring a registry study to Africa, but the issues of availability of the treatment and the therapies that we are kind of thinking has to be in place for that study is really a challenge. You have to overcome the cultural challenges, and also you have to make sure that there are no conflicts of interest. And finally, the ugly. The ugly is the fact that although it is gold standard to develop therapeutic interventions, clinical trial is not required to introduce new therapies to most African countries. This breaks my heart. I mean, I've kind of, because of the work that I do, I've had the pleasure of traveling to different African countries. And you can see that, as opposed to where I practice in the United States, that you cannot introduce new therapies without making sure that those therapies really work in the population in the United States. Therapies are being brought to African countries without no clinical trials. So you don't even know whether they're going to work in them or not. I mean, that really is very challenging to Africa. And that needs to be something that the regulatory bodies take up when it comes to clinical trials. So just to conclude, as an introduction, with that representation, sufficient representation of Africans in clinical trials, and we can replace this by Blacks in the United States or replace it by Caribbeans in the Caribbean island, optimal prevention, diagnosis, and treatment decisions cannot be made for them. Cannot. You think about that. Let's just pause and think about that. Let's just pause and think about the implication. We are putting therapies in our body that has not been effectively tested to work in us. Let us pause and think about it. So having the means to be able to get clinical trials into African nations, clinical trials into Caribbean islands, and clinical trials accessible to underrepresented populations in the United States is really important and very urgent that we take care of this. So There are some things that we are working on as innovative projects to be able to improve oncology clinical trials in Africa. And one of them is a project that is being funded by the Carnegie African Diaspora Fellowship, with me and Professor Lynn Denny heading this project. And it's for us to do an assessment of the clinical trials readiness of African institutions. So if you are an investigator in Africa, you are going to be getting a survey from us. So what we kind of want to do is to do an environmental scan of the infrastructure, the resources, as well as the expertise for clinical trials in Africa. We are going to send out a survey to just sort of look at what is the status quo, what is the readiness for clinical trials. Another project that we are concurrently doing and parallelly doing also is that currently we have student trainees at University of Florida, 15 of them, who are now working tirelessly to pull all the clinical trials that are currently existing in Africa. In all the 54 countries that are in Africa, we are trying to document it through a database, and we are working with a team of experts and organizations and institutions across to be able to find a way to make that available to patients on a platform. So there are things that we're trying to do to be able to improve clinical trials and identify and build virtual platform that will provide this comprehensive information, because it should be accessible to us. If there's a patient in Kigali, Rwanda, and they want to join a clinical trial, they should be able to go to a place, use their phone, take a look and see, is there a clinical trial near me for breast cancer that I can join? That is something that we hope that we can do. And if there is a funding agency or a pharmaceutical company who wants to put in clinical trials in somewhere in Africa, they should be able to say, okay, if I click on this map, if I go to Ghana, these are the resources that are available. These are the investigators with the right expertise. I can quickly go to them and I can see what else needs to be done in building infrastructure, in building capacity to be able to start clinical trials in Ghana. That is what we are focused on. Doing in different countries, Nigeria, Ghana, sub-Saharan areas, anywhere in Africa. So these two platforms that we're building will be very, very important for us to be able to get this work done. So I'm going to conclude by inviting everybody to the Global Congress on Oncology Clinical Trials for Blacks. It's going to take place November 14 through 16 in Lagos, Nigeria. This is where we are going to actually launch the two platforms that we are working on: the public platform for patients to be able to get access to clinical trials in Africa, as well as the other platform that is going to provide the infrastructure and the resources that we have in Africa for clinical trials. Finally, for those of you who are interested in prostate cancer, I would also like to invite you to join us for the Science of Global Prostate Cancer Disparities in Black Men Conference, also taking place in Nigeria. It's going to be in a University of Ilorin, November 7th through the 10th. So I'm going to end by acknowledging the funding that has supported a lot of our work, especially the Carnegie African Diaspora Fellowship 2017 and 2018. And